Tape world, the music store cassettes couldn't save. In the late 1970s, when disco was dying and punk was rising, when the Sony Walkman was about to revolutionize how we consumed music, a bold entrepreneur named George Levy made a bet that would define nearly 2 decades of American retail music history. Levy, a former electronics distributor who had watched the slow decline of 8-track tapes with the keen eye of someone who understood format transitions, saw something others missed in the humble cassette tape. While record stores continued to prioritize vinyl and dismiss cassettes as inferior, Levy opened the first Tape World location in Albany, New York in 1978, creating what would become America's largest cassette-only music retailer. This wasn't just another record store with a tape section tucked in the corner. This was a temple to the compact cassette, a format-specific retailer that would grow to over 300 locations across 35 states before ultimately discovering that betting everything on a single music format was like trying to catch lightning in a bottle during a thunderstorm. The timing seemed perfect. Cassettes had been around since Philips introduced them in 1963, but it took until the mid-1970s for the technology to mature enough to challenge vinyl's sound quality dominance. By 1978, cassette sales were growing at 30% annually while vinyl sales remained flat. The format offered something revolutionary: true portability. You could record on cassettes, play them in cars without worrying about skips, and most importantly, they were compact enough to fit in your pocket. Levy understood that cassettes weren't just another music format, they were a lifestyle change. His stores reflected this philosophy. The typical Tape World location was bright, modern, and organized with an almost obsessive attention to cassette-specific needs. The stores featured listening stations with high-quality headphones, recording equipment sections where customers could buy blank tapes and dubbing decks, and staff who were trained to understand the technical aspects of cassette recording and playback. Unlike traditional record stores that often felt like dusty archives run by musical snobs, Tape World locations were designed to feel accessible and contemporary. The company's slogan, "The world revolves around tape," wasn't just marketing hyperbole, it was a business philosophy that would carry them through their first decade of explosive growth. The early 1980s were the golden age for Tape World, coinciding perfectly with the cassette format's cultural dominance. The introduction of the Sony Walkman in 1979 had created a portable music revolution, and suddenly everyone needed cassettes. By 1983, when compact discs were still an expensive novelty that required a $400 player, Tape World was opening new locations at a rate of nearly 2 per month. The company's growth strategy was aggressive and methodical. They targeted mid-sized markets that major record store chains often ignored, focusing on suburban shopping centers and strip malls where parking was plentiful and rent was reasonable. Each store carried approximately 8,000 different cassette titles, far more than the typical record store's cassette selection. They maintained relationships with over 400 different record labels, including small independent labels that other retailers ignored. This deep catalog approach meant that Tape World often had obscure or specialty releases that customers couldn't find anywhere else. The company also pioneered several retail innovations that would later become industry standards. They were among the first music retailers to use computerized inventory systems, allowing them to track sales data and reorder popular titles automatically. They offered a liberal return policy on defective cassettes, understanding that the format's mechanical nature made quality control issues inevitable. Most significantly, they created a membership program that offered discounts on bulk purchases, recognizing that serious music fans often bought multiple albums at once. The company's success wasn't just about being in the right place at the right time, though timing certainly helped. George Levy proved to be a shrewd operator who understood both the technical and cultural aspects of the cassette revolution. He recognized that cassettes appealed to different demographics than vinyl. While record buyers were often serious audiophiles and collectors, cassette buyers were frequently casual listeners who valued convenience over sonic perfection. Tape World's marketing reflected this understanding. Instead of emphasizing artist prestige or audio quality, their advertising focused on selection, convenience, and value. The company ran promotions like 10 tapes for $10 on selected catalog titles and blank tape bonanzas that sold high-quality recording cassettes in bulk. They partnered with local radio stations to sponsor mixtape contests and promoted the social aspects of cassette culture, particularly the phenomenon of making personalized compilation tapes for friends and romantic interests. By 1985, Tape World had become more than a retail chain. It was a cultural institution that understood and celebrated cassette culture in all its forms. The company's annual revenue reached $45 million that year, with individual stores averaging over $200,000 in annual sales. Wall Street took notice, and Levy began exploring options for taking the company public, believing that Tape World's growth was just beginning. However, the seeds of Tape World's eventual downfall were already being planted in the mid-1980s, though they wouldn't become apparent for several more years. The compact disc, introduced in 1982, was slowly gaining market acceptance as prices for CD players dropped and the format's superior sound quality became undeniable. By 1986, CD sales were growing at over 100% annually, while cassette sales growth had slowed to single digits. More ominously for Tape World, the music industry was beginning to shift its promotional priorities toward the new format. Record labels started releasing CD versions of albums weeks or even months before cassette versions became available. New releases increasingly featured bonus tracks or enhanced audio quality that wasn't available on cassette versions. The writing was on the wall, but George Levy and his management team made a series of strategic decisions that, in retrospect, accelerated their eventual demise. Rather than diversifying into CDs, they doubled down on cassettes, believing that the format's price advantage and compatibility with existing car stereo systems would sustain demand. They also convinced themselves that CDs were a niche format that would never achieve mass market acceptance due to their higher cost and the expense of CD players. This miscalculation would prove fatal, but it seemed reasonable at the time. In 1987, a typical CD cost $15 to $18 compared to $8 to $10 for a cassette, and CD players still cost over $200 while cassette players could be purchased for under $50. The late 1980s marked the beginning of Tape World's slow decline, though the company's financial troubles weren't immediately apparent to outside observers. The chain continued expanding, reaching its peak of 312 locations in 1988, but same-store sales were declining as customers increasingly gravitated toward compact discs. The company's narrow focus, which had been its greatest strength during cassettes' ascendancy, became a critical weakness as the market shifted. Unlike broad-based music retailers who could adjust their inventory mix to accommodate changing customer preferences, Tape World was structurally committed to a format that was becoming obsolete. Management finally recognized the existential threat posed by compact discs and attempted to adapt, but their efforts were half-hearted and poorly executed. In 1989, they began adding small CD sections to their larger stores, but these sections felt like afterthoughts rather than integral parts of the shopping experience. The staff, trained extensively in cassette technology, lacked expertise about digital audio. The store's entire layout and merchandising philosophy was built around cassette-specific needs, making the integration of CDs awkward and inefficient. More critically, Tape World had spent over a decade building relationships with customers who valued cassettes specifically. These customers were often price-conscious consumers who were slow to adopt expensive new technologies. As the market moved toward CDs, Tape World found itself serving a shrinking demographic while failing to attract the affluent early adopters who were driving compact disc sales. The early 1990s brought a cascade of problems that would ultimately prove insurmountable. Compact disc sales surpassed cassette sales for the first time in 1991, and the gap widened dramatically each subsequent year. By 1993, CDs outsold cassettes by more than 2 to 1, and major record labels were beginning to phase out cassette versions of new releases entirely. Tape World's attempts to reinvent itself as a broader music retailer were hampered by lease agreements, store layouts, and a corporate culture that had been optimized for a single format. The company's financial situation deteriorated rapidly as sales declined and inventory write-downs mounted. They were forced to close over 100 locations between 1991 and 1993, concentrating operations in their strongest markets while attempting to renegotiate supplier agreements and lease terms. The closures created a vicious cycle, as reduced purchasing power meant worse terms from record labels and distributors, which in turn made it harder to compete with larger, more diversified music retailers. Meanwhile, competition was intensifying from multiple directions. Large chain stores like Tower Records and Virgin Megastores offered enormous CD selections in cathedral-like spaces that made music shopping feel like a cultural experience. At the other end of the spectrum, discount retailers like Walmart and Target were using popular music as loss leaders, selling hit CDs at prices that barely covered Tape World's wholesale costs. The company found itself squeezed between high-end experiential retailers and low-cost mass merchants, with a product mix that appealed to fewer customers each year. The final years of Tape World's existence were a study in corporate desperation and the impossibility of swimming against technological tides. In 1994, management made a last-ditch attempt to save the company by pivoting toward used CDs and vinyl records, recognizing that new cassette sales were no longer sufficient to sustain operations. They partnered with local record collectors to buy and resell pre-owned music in all formats, hoping to differentiate themselves from chain competitors who focused exclusively on new releases. Some locations were converted into hybrid stores that combined new and used music with music-related merchandise like t-shirts, posters, and audio equipment. These efforts showed occasional promise, but they came too late and required capital investments that the financially strapped company couldn't afford. The used music strategy also demanded different expertise and operational systems than Tape World's management possessed. Evaluating, pricing, and merchandising used records and CDs required knowledge that went far beyond their cassette-focused experience. Customer demographics were also completely different. Used record buyers were often serious collectors and music enthusiasts who demanded deep knowledge and specialized service, the exact opposite of the casual, convenience-oriented customers who had sustained Tape World during its heyday. The company's final expansion attempt came in 1995, when they opened a dozen superstore-sized locations in major metropolitan markets, hoping to compete directly with Tower Records and other music superstores. These massive locations featured over 20,000 titles across all formats, listening stations, performance spaces, and extensive merchandise selections. However, the economics were brutal. The large spaces required expensive leases, extensive staffing, and enormous inventory investments that Tape World's deteriorating finances couldn't support. By late 1995, Tape World's situation had become desperate. The company was burning through cash at an unsustainable rate, vendor relationships were strained due to slow payments, and employee morale was plummeting as store closures accelerated. George Levy, who had built the company from a single location into a retail empire, found himself presiding over its dismantlement. The final blow came during the 1995 Christmas season, traditionally the most important period for music retailers. Despite having what should have been attractive merchandise at competitive prices, Tape World's sales were catastrophically bad. Customers simply weren't interested in cassettes anymore, and the company's CD and used music selections weren't compelling enough to drive significant traffic. In January 1996, with creditors demanding payment and suppliers refusing to extend additional credit, Tape World filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company attempted to restructure its debts and emerge as a smaller, more focused retailer, but the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Their core product was obsolete, and they lacked the resources to successfully reinvent themselves. The bankruptcy process became a liquidation by summer 1996, with remaining inventory sold off at deep discounts and store fixtures auctioned to other retailers. The last Tape World location closed in September 1996, ending an 18-year run that had begun with such promise and ended in such disappointment. George Levy, who had once seemed like a visionary for recognizing cassette's potential, was forced to watch his life's work disappear as completely as the 8-track tapes that had inspired his original insight. The story of Tape World serves as a cautionary tale about the risks of format-specific retail in an industry characterized by rapid technological change. The company's rise and fall perfectly paralleled the compact cassette's own trajectory from revolutionary innovation to obsolete technology. In many ways, Tape World did everything right during cassette's golden age. They provided superior selection, knowledgeable service, and competitive prices while building a corporate culture that understood and celebrated their chosen format. Their mistake wasn't in recognizing cassette's potential, but in failing to anticipate how quickly and completely the market would abandon the format once a superior alternative became available. The compact disc offered everything that cassettes provided: portability, durability, convenience, plus dramatically superior sound quality and immunity to the mechanical problems that plagued tape-based formats. Once CD prices became competitive and players became affordable, there was simply no reason for most consumers to continue buying cassettes. Tape World's story also illustrates the broader challenges facing specialty retailers in an era of increasing consolidation and technological disruption. The company's narrow focus, which had been a competitive advantage during cassettes' growth phase, became a fatal liability when market conditions changed. Their attempts to diversify into other formats and retail strategies came too late and were hampered by financial constraints, lease obligations, and organizational cultures that had been optimized for a different kind of business. Perhaps most significantly, Tape World's demise foreshadowed the struggles that would eventually impact the entire physical music retail industry as digital distribution and online commerce transformed how consumers acquired music. The same forces that made cassettes obsolete would eventually challenge CDs, and many of the big-box music retailers that contributed to Tape World's downfall would themselves become casualties of the digital revolution. In the end, Tape World's 18-year journey from startup to bankruptcy encapsulated both the opportunities and perils of betting everything on a single technology in an industry where the only constant is change.